Jason Miller was humiliated in his own backyard when the HOA falsely accused him of causing trouble, turning a harmless hobby into a nightmare. Marlene Whitaker, obsessed with control and order, reveled in making him feel powerless, her self-righteous fury threatening to crush his spirit. But just as hope seemed lost, an unexpected visit from Navy SEAL mentors revealed Jason's true achievements, shifting the entire confrontation in his favor. And just wait until you see how the tension exploded into a triumphant ending, proving that courage and integrity can overcome even the most petty injustice. It all started on an unusually warm, sunlit afternoon in Riverside, California. The streets were quiet, the kind of suburban calm that made every little sound feel amplified. The rustle of leaves in the wind, a dog barking a few blocks away, the distant hum of a lawnmower. In the Miller backyard, Jason Miller, a 16-year-old with a knack for technology and a sharp curiosity, was engrossed in his favorite pastime, tinkering with his drone. The device hovered gracefully above the freshly mown lawn, responding to his steady hands and practiced commands. Jason loved the way the drone allowed him to see the world from a new perspective, a bird's-eye view of his neighborhood he had never experienced before. It was his escape, a place where he felt both control and freedom, away from the usual chaos of school, social pressures, and the occasional friction with his father over screen time. Jason adjusted the drone's camera, angling it for a better view of the backyard when the tranquility shattered. A sharp, urgent voice pierced the air like a warning siren. "Your kid has been causing disturbances. I'm calling the police." Jason froze, eyes widening as he looked up. Marlene Whitaker, the HOA president, stood at the edge of the yard, her face flushed a vivid shade of red, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear but with the intensity of her self-appointed authority. She was the kind of neighbor everyone in Riverside knew about, meticulous, controlling, and obsessed with rules to the point that minor deviations became personal affronts. Marlene had always taken pride in maintaining the image of a flawless community, but her dedication to order often crossed the line into aggression. Today, it was Jason's harmless drone that had become her latest battleground. Jason's heart pounded. I'm not disturbing anyone," he stammered, clutching the drone controller as if it were a shield. "I'm flying it in my backyard like the rules say." Marlene's eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a tight, dismissive line. Rules don't matter when your actions disrupt the neighborhood. You don't get to decide that, young man." Her voice rose an octave, trembling with indignation. Her fingers jabbed toward him in accusation, as though each movement could somehow imprint guilt directly onto Jason. The sense of injustice hit Jason like a punch to the chest. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated like a criminal. Within minutes, the sound of tires crunching against the pavement announced the arrival of 2 uniformed officers. They stepped onto the driveway, their expressions neutral but firm, the weight of authority pressing down on the small yard. Jason looked at them, wide-eyed, trying to process what was happening. The officers did not smile, did not ask for clarification. They simply stared, the kind of gaze that made him feel small, exposed, and accused without cause. Mark Miller, Jason's father, emerged from the kitchen, a towel in his hands and confusion etched into his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. He caught sight of Marlene and the officers and felt a flicker of frustration. He could sense the absurdity of the situation, but it wasn't until he saw the way the officers' gaze locked onto Jason that something deeper stirred inside him. A rare, fiery anger, sharp and insistent. How could something so petty, a kid flying a drone in his own backyard, escalate into a confrontation involving law enforcement? Mark's chest tightened as he watched Marlene's self-righteous expression, her authority wielded like a weapon. He felt the heat of indignation rising, a mixture of disbelief and protective fury. How could anyone think it was acceptable to terrorize a teenager over a harmless hobby? Why did Marlene feel entitled to invade their privacy, to dictate behavior in a home that wasn't hers to govern? Jason stood frozen, the controller still clutched in his hands. He felt the sting of humiliation, the sharp edge of injustice that made his stomach churn. His cheeks burned, not from the sun, but from the absurdity and unfairness of the situation. Marlene's accusations seemed limitless, her insistence on punishment relentless. Every word out of her mouth felt like a hammer striking his sense of security. Mark stepped closer to Jason, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, trying to anchor him amidst the storm. "Jason, it's okay. Stay calm," he murmured, though his own voice trembled slightly with barely contained anger. He could feel it building, a simmering heat of protective instinct and outrage at the sheer audacity of the HOA president. The sense of injustice was palpable in the air, thick enough to choke on. What should have been a peaceful afternoon filled with curiosity and quiet satisfaction had turned into a theater of absurdity, and at the center of it all, a teenager who had done nothing wrong was being scrutinized, judged, and threatened simply for living in his own home. Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing, a silent vow forming. This situation would not stand, and someone somehow would answer for this brazen display of cruelty. The anger had begun, and it would only grow from here. Jason's hands shook uncontrollably as the officers questioned him, their voices calm but firm, like a metronome of authority, keeping him in a rhythm of fear and self-doubt. Each question, each pause felt heavier than the last, pressing down on him as if the entire world had decided to weigh its judgment upon a single 16-year-old. He tried to explain, tried to make them understand that the drone was completely legal, that it was a harmless hobby he loved. But the words stuck in his throat. They seemed irrelevant in the eyes of the law, and even more irrelevant in the eyes of Marlene Whitaker, whose satisfaction seemed to grow with every passing second. Jason's throat tightened. A lump of humiliation lodged there, refusing to let him speak freely. The sting of shame wasn't just in the officer's gaze, it was in the quiet scrutiny of the neighbors. Peeking through curtains and across fences, they whispered behind half-closed blinds. Eyes darted toward him, and he felt every glance as if it were a needle threading the idea of wrongdoing into his own consciousness. He could feel their judgment, the subtle nods of approval for Marlene's interference, and the quiet disapproval of those who might have sympathized but were too timid to act. From the corner of his eye, he could see Marlene's smug grin. Her expression was a trophy, a demonstration of her perceived victory over a young boy she considered careless, disobedient, or disruptive. She leaned slightly forward, hands on her hips, as if she were the general of a battlefield that only existed in her mind. Jason's stomach churned. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was being scrutinized, accused, and made to feel small. His sanctuary, the backyard where he had spent countless hours exploring, inventing, and dreaming, was now a stage for humiliation. Mark Miller, his father, stood nearby, heart heavy with helplessness. He had arrived on the scene fully aware of the absurdity, but entirely unprepared for the emotional toll on his son. The sight of Jason trembling and quiet stirred something in Mark that went beyond anger. It was guilt, a deep, gnawing guilt for not being there enough, for the times he prioritized work over family, for assuming the world outside would treat Jason fairly. "This isn't just harassment," he muttered under his breath, almost as if saying it out loud could make the injustice tangible. This is emotional warfare against my kid." The air seemed to thicken with tension. Jason's legs felt rooted to the grass, as if the ground itself recognized the unfairness pressing down on him. He felt trapped, a prisoner in what had once been the safest place he knew. The neighborhood, once familiar and comforting, had become a cage. Its picket fences now barriers, its quiet streets no longer welcoming. Every sound, the murmur of a neighbor, the hum of the drone's motor, the clicking of the officer's pens, was amplified, echoing through his chest like a drumbeat of anxiety and despair. He glanced at his father, eyes wide, silently pleading for protection or for some magic solution that could undo the situation. Mark could only offer what little reassurance he had, placing a steadying hand on Jason's shoulder. But the weight of helplessness was mutual. He felt powerless to shield his son from the scrutiny of the neighborhood, from the cruelty of someone like Marlene who seemed to take personal joy in his suffering. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could a harmless drone, something meant to inspire curiosity, learning, and joy, be twisted into an act of supposed disruption? How could a single adult wield authority so recklessly, so vindictively, and so without consequence? He had always considered Riverside a safe community, a place where kids could grow without fear of arbitrary persecution. Now that illusion was shattered, replaced by anxiety and confusion. He felt small, powerless, and utterly alone, as if the world had shifted overnight and left him stranded in the shadow of someone else's arbitrary power. Every second stretched on, each pause in questioning echoing like a hammer against his confidence. Jason's heart felt heavy, each beat a reminder of the humiliation he endured. He had imagined himself as clever, capable, and safe in his own home. But those illusions had been ripped away, replaced by the stark, painful reality of being treated like a threat, simply for existing in his own yard. And in the midst of it all, Marlene's smug smile lingered in his mind, a reminder that the pain wasn't just from the officers or the situation. It came from someone who believed she had the right to make him feel powerless. And in that realization, Jason understood the full weight of the injustice he faced. The afternoon air still vibrated with tension. Every corner of the Miller house waited with unease. Jason sat on the edge of the porch, fingers gripping the drone controller like a lifeline, while Marlene Whitaker's sharp eyes darted between him and the officers, her satisfaction practically audible in the way she held herself. Mark Miller stood a few steps behind his son, jaw tight, feeling the frustration and helplessness thrum through his chest. It had seemed like there was no way out, that a harmless hobby had become a symbol of guilt and punishment, and the humiliation of the situation would linger indefinitely. Then a knock. At first it was subtle, almost polite, just a tap, tap, tap against the front door, but in that moment it sounded like a trumpet signaling change. Mark turned, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Oh, who could that be?" he muttered under his breath. Jason glanced up, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. The officers, meanwhile, straightened, a flicker of confusion crossing their features. Marlene's expression remained sharp, guarded, but there was a subtle tightening at the corners of her eyes, as if she sensed that something unexpected had arrived. Mark walked to the door and pulled it open. 3 men stood there, dressed casually, yet radiating a presence that immediately commanded attention. Their posture, the calm in their eyes, the ease with which they held themselves, everything about them spoke of experience, authority, and quiet competence. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand with a reassuring smile. "Mr. Miller?" "We're here for Jason," he said simply. Jason's brow furrowed in confusion. "Here for me?" he asked. His voice was small, tentative, but a spark of curiosity ignited within him. The men nodded. "Yes, we're Navy SEALs," another explained, "and we're part of a youth mentorship program your school recommended." Jason earned a spot through his achievements in STEM and leadership. "We're here to meet him and support his growth." Time seemed to slow. The officers blinked, shifting uneasily. Their previous assumptions, so confidently applied, now wavered under the undeniable weight of truth. Marlene's smugness faltered almost imperceptibly at first. Then it became more pronounced, her shoulders stiffening as her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Jason's chest lifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as the reality of the situation began to shift. The men's calm, professional tone and the legitimacy of their presence brought a sudden, tangible sense of hope. For the first time in what felt like hours, he realized that he was not alone, that the truth of his hard work, his discipline, and his accomplishments could not be overshadowed by Marlene's relentless criticism. The SEALs continued, their words measured but firm, explaining Jason's involvement in the program, his awards, his contributions to his school's STEM projects, and the mentorship schedule that was already planned. Every word was like a bridge reconnecting Jason to the sense of pride he had almost forgotten in the chaos of accusations. The officers exchanged quick glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Their previous certainty had been shaken, replaced by a cautious acknowledgement that this was more than a typical neighborhood complaint. Marlene's jaw dropped, the color draining from her face. Her posture, once so rigid with authority, sagged slightly as the weight of undeniable truth pressed down on her. She had built her entire day around a victory that now seemed impossible to claim. Jason could see the fleeting panic in her eyes, a sharp contrast to the self-assured grin she had worn moments before. Mark felt his own shoulders relax, the heavy knot of worry beginning to loosen. He glanced at Jason, whose hand still clutched the controller, but now with a lighter grip. There was a glimmer of something new in his eyes. Confidence. Validation. The first hint that justice might still be possible. The nightmare of humiliation, at least for the moment, had been interrupted by a force that reminded everyone present. Truth and achievement carry weight that intimidation cannot erase. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile tugged at Jason's lips. He felt the hope rise inside him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It wasn't just the men at the door, it was the recognition that his efforts, his dedication, and his integrity were visible to the world, and in that recognition the idea that he could survive, even thrive, in the face of petty injustice took root. For the first time that afternoon, Jason dared to breathe a little easier. The tension that had seemed unbearable now felt like a challenge he could meet, a puzzle that could be solved. Justice wasn't lost, not yet. And in that moment, amid the quiet authority of the unexpected visitors and the crumbling confidence of Marlene Whitaker, hope bloomed. The atmosphere in the Miller household shifted almost immediately after the SEALs had stepped in. Their calm authority and the undeniable evidence of Jason's accomplishments left no room for doubt. The officers who had moments before scrutinized Jason as if he were a threat now looked apologetic, shuffling papers and murmuring words of regret. We understand now," one officer said, a faint edge of embarrassment in his tone. "Thank you for clarifying, sir." "And, young man, I apologize for the confusion." Without further ceremony, they departed, leaving the driveway quiet and the tension slowly ebbing from the air. Marlene Whitaker, the HOA president, remained standing, but the confident posture she had carried so proudly now crumpled. Her face flushed bright red, eyes darting in frantic disbelief, and her lips moved in stammering protest. I didn't know, she began, but no one listened. The truth of Jason's innocence and his remarkable accomplishments rendered her words powerless. Every ounce of control she had tried to wield that afternoon had slipped through her fingers, leaving her exposed and unmasked in front of the very neighbors she sought to impress. For Marlene, the realization was jarring. Her relentless pursuit of perceived order had backfired spectacularly, and she had no victory to claim. Jason exhaled deeply, a weight lifting from his chest, the knot of anxiety, fear, and humiliation that had coiled around him since the incident. Began hours earlier, now loosened. He felt taller, steadier, as if some invisible burden had been removed. His hands, once trembling with uncertainty, now rested comfortably at his sides, and a quiet pride swelled in his chest. This was not just relief, it was triumph, born from endurance, truth, and the unwavering recognition of his achievements. Mark Miller approached, his own relief tempered with awe. He placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, and in that simple gesture the bond between father and son deepened. Words were unnecessary, the shared experience of facing unfairness, enduring its pressure, and witnessing its resolution had created a connection stronger than any conversation could achieve. Mark's eyes met Jason's, and in them he saw courage, resilience, and the quiet determination of a young man who had stood firm in the face of adversity. The SEALS, now preparing to leave, offered nods of acknowledgement and encouragement. "Keep pursuing your passions," one said to Jason, smiling with genuine respect. "Your dedication, your curiosity, and your integrity will carry you far. Remember, courage isn't always about physical action. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Jason absorbed the words, each one igniting a sense of purpose within him. He understood in a way he hadn't before that bravery often manifests not in spectacular feats but in moments of steadfastness and truth. As the SEALS walked down the driveway, Jason turned back to the backyard, now quiet and serene once again. The drone rested on the grass untouched, a symbol of his resilience. The neighborhood that had felt like a cage just hours earlier now seemed familiar and safe again. Reclaimed not through force, but through integrity and courage. Every glance at the sky reminded him that obstacles, no matter how intimidating, could be met and overcome with patience, perseverance, and the knowledge that truth has its own strength. Mark joined him at the edge of the lawn, and together they watched the sunlight fall over the fences and streets of Riverside. The confrontation with Marlene, the intrusion of doubt and humiliation, and the unexpected arrival of mentors had all combined into a lesson that neither would forget. Jason realized that standing up for himself had required not only courage but also faith in his abilities and his character. He felt empowered, confident that future challenges, no matter how daunting, could be faced with composure and principle. For anyone witnessing Jason's story, the lesson was unmistakable. Small acts of unfairness, no matter how calculated or seemingly overwhelming, can encounter the greatest force in courage, integrity, and persistence. Triumph is not always measured in grand gestures or public accolades. It is measured in the quiet moments when one stands up for what is right, remains true to oneself, and refuses to allow intimidation to dictate one's path. Jason glanced at his father, then at the driveway where Marlene had retreated, and finally back to the sky above. In that moment, hope had transformed into lasting inspiration, a reminder that justice, truth, and courage are forces no petty vendetta can defeat.